Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, December 19th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Lloyd visits Israel and vows support for Gaza slaughter. So Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin met with Israeli officials in Tel Aviv on Monday and vowed continued U.S. military support for the Israeli onslaught on Gaza, despite the massive civilian casualty rate. So in a meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Austin said that the U.S. commitment to Israel is unshakable. He said, quote, "America's commitment to Israel is unwavering, and no individual group or state should test our resolve," end quote. Austin vowed that the U.S. would continue to provide Israel with the equipment that it needs, referring to the bombs that the U.S. has been shipping there and other military equipment. And the Pentagon has said that these arms shipments have continued on a near daily basis since October 7th. U.S. officials have said that they want Israel to wrap up the current phase of the war, which involves the constant airstrikes and the ground campaign. They want them to finish that in the next few weeks and then take a more targeted approach against Hamas, a more limited attack. Austin said that the U.S. had thoughts about more surgical operations, but he made clear the timeline of the onslaught, the timeline of the operations is up to Israel. Austin said, quote, "Regarding the timeline, this is Israel's operation, and I'm not here to dictate timeline or terms. Our support to Israel's right to defend itself is ironclad, as you've heard me say a number of times, and that's not going to change," end quote. So just like these concerns that we hear for civilian casualties, this idea that the U.S. wants them to take a more surgical or more limited approach, doesn't look like they're putting really any pressure on Israel to do this. Austin says there he's not dictating anything. There's no sign that the U.S. is leveraging military aid, still providing this unconditional military support, which includes letting Israel use these bombs that the U.S. is shipping, with no limits. Doesn't matter what they're bombing. So at a press conference with Austin, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said that the Israeli military would continue to operate in different levels of intensity, which is how he put it. And they'll do that as they see fit and will eventually transition gradually into the next phase of the war. So when discussing civilian casualties, Austin said, quote, "Protecting Palestinian civilians in Gaza is both a moral duty and a strategic imperative," end quote. But he also gave cover for Israeli slaughter of civilians, saying that the population density in Gaza makes it very, very difficult for the Israeli operations. So if he's saying it's a moral duty to protect Palestinian civilians, that means that the U.S. should not be supporting what Israel's doing in Gaza. So, they say one thing on one hand about civilian casualties, but the truth is they don't really care because they're still providing all this support that Israel relies on. And the death toll still over 19,000, including over 7,500 children so far. And the next one here, Human Rights Watch says that Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. So Human Rights Watch released a report on Monday that said Israel is committing a war crime in Gaza by using starvation as a weapon of war against civilians. HRW said that Israeli forces are, quote, "deliberately blocking the delivery of water, food, and fuel while willfully impeding humanitarian assistance, apparently razing agricultural areas and depriving the civilian population of objects indispensable to their survival," end quote. This report pointed to comments from Israeli officials expressing their aim to deprive Palestinians of food and other basic necessities. If you remember at the beginning of this, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant announced a complete siege on Gaza, which is already under blockade, he announced their intention to cut off everything. No food, no fuel, no electricity, no water. And he said that Israel was fighting human animals. And remember, Gaza, about half the population is children. Israel has since allowed a limited aid deliveries through Gaza's border crossing with Egypt. But HRW said that the amount of aid is at grossly insufficient levels, and the UN and other aid organizations that operate on the ground say that the Israeli expansion of operations in South Gaza have made relief efforts basically impossible. So they quote Omar Shakir, who is the Human Rights Watch's Israel-Palestine director, saying, quote, "For over 2 months, Israel has been depriving Gaza's population of food and water, a policy spurred on or endorsed by high-ranking Israeli officials and reflecting an intent to starve civilians as a method of warfare," end quote. So earlier this month, the UN's World Food Program said that 9 out of 10 households in northern Gaza and 2 out of 3 households in southern Gaza had spent at least one full day and night without food. Besides the food deprivation in Gaza, disease is also spreading due to a lack of clean water and other conditions caused by the Israeli siege. So this is something I know I say a lot, but the death toll, over 19,000, and that's just from the bombs and the bullets. As this thing goes on, I mean, once people start dying, once this really kicks in, it can happen really fast that a lot of people starve to death, a lot of people die of disease. And if Israel keeps going the way that they're going, we might really see, who knows how many people are going to be dead at the end of this thing. All right, so the next one here, Palestinian detainees from Gaza die in Israeli custody. This article is from Middle East Eye. It's actually based on a report from Haaretz, the Israeli paper. Several Palestinians from Gaza held by Israel in a military detention facility have died in unclear circumstances, according to a report in Haaretz on Monday. Hundreds of Palestinians in the besieged enclave have reportedly been arrested by Israeli soldiers and taken to a detention facility in the Negev desert in southern Israel. Several of those taken have since died, with the circumstances of their deaths not being explained by the Israeli authorities. Israel's military told Haaretz those dead in the facility were terrorists and the deaths were now under investigation. Those detained are kept in fenced compounds with their eyes covered and hands cuffed for most of the day. So they're being kept blindfolded. If you see this picture here of Palestinians in the back of a truck with blindfolds on. And women and children have also been detained. Women and children have been arrested by Israeli soldiers in Gaza and are being held in a detention facility near Jerusalem, the report added. Middle East Eye reported last week that the Israeli army had arbitrarily detained dozens of women and girls from Gaza without disclosing their whereabouts or the charges they face. So I think I covered that report last week, and this Haaretz report seems to be confirming that. According to Haaretz, only around 10 to 15% of Palestinians detained by Israel in Gaza in recent days are connected with Hamas. Palestinians from Gaza are being held under the unlawful combatants law, which human rights activists and legal experts have long argued is a means used by Israel to detain civilians based on little evidence and without a fair trial. Just a really horrible situation for the people that are getting rounded up. All right, so the next one here, Gaza grandfather describes killing of his family by Israeli soldiers. This article is from Reuters. They spoke with a elderly Palestinian man in Gaza who said Israeli troops massacred his family right in front of him. When the Israeli soldiers entered the Gaza school where Yusuf Khalil was sleeping near his family, they began shooting indiscriminately, killing 9 people, including children, he said, pointing to bullet-pocked, blood-stained walls. His account, which Israel's military says it is looking into, comes after the killing of 3 hostages escaping Hamas in Gaza raised new questions over Israel's rules of engagement in a war that's proven unusually deadly for civilians. According to Khalil, he was sheltering with his family in early December in the Shadia school in the Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza, where some of the most intense recent fighting has been. Jabalia is in the part of the territory that Israel has told civilians to leave since October. He said, quote, "They are my children and grandchildren. Why did they shoot them in front of my eyes?" End quote. And we've seen, there's that Al Jazeera report where Palestinians said that IDF soldiers walked in and I forget where they were sheltering or where exactly that was. I believe it was at a school. And they said IDF troops walked in and just started mowing people down. And here's another account of that from this man who lost his family. And then he also says that they started to shoot all around and that they finished shooting and saw that he was moving, and they told him that he wasn't allowed to leave the room or something. So just another horrific account from this Palestinian. All right. So the next one here, U.S. launches a Red Sea military operation. So the U.S. has formally announced the launch of a new military operation in the Red Sea aimed at responding to attacks on commercial shipping by Yemen's Houthis that started in response to the brutal Israeli assault on Gaza. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin announced the initiative dubbed Operation Prosperity Guardian while on a trip to the region, and said that the other countries taking part include the UK, Bahrain, Canada, France, Italy, Netherlands, Norway, the Seychelles, and Spain. So Bahrain, the only Arab country in there that is joining in so far. The Houthi attacks have forced some of the world's largest shipping lines to suspend Red Sea transits, which is going to have a big impact on the global economy. The British energy giant BP announced on Monday that it was stopping all shipments of oil and gas through the water. So that's another huge company saying that they're not going to sail through there anymore. So the Houthis, known as Ansar Allah, have vowed to target all ships heading to and from Israel, and said the only way to restore calm to the region is through a lasting ceasefire in Gaza. The Houthis have shown no sign of backing down, and they announced on Monday that they launched 2 drone attacks on commercial vessels. So the attacks continue, and the U.S. is considering taking military action. It's not clear exactly what this big naval task force is going to do. I guess they're going to be there to try to intercept missiles and drones, as U.S. warships have already been doing that. But now they've formally announced this new military operation. So there's an interesting report in Bloomberg that said that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are split on how the U.S. should respond. So the U.S. has backed the Saudi-UAE coalition against the Houthis since 2015. The Saudis and the UAE kind of back different players in this war. The Saudis back the so-called internationally recognized government that's been exiled from Yemen. I mean, they have some control of some territory on the ground, but not much. And then you have the UAE, who backs the Southern Transition Council, which wants to separate what used to be South Yemen from what used to be North Yemen. So anyway, apparently the UAE wants the U.S. to take direct military action against the Houthis and redesignate them as a foreign terrorist organization, which would make the peace deal between the Saudis and the Houthis, it would be impossible to implement. And then the Saudis fear that military action against the Houthis could provoke more attacks, and they're worried that their oil facilities would start coming under attack again. That was a big reason why the Saudis decided to make peace with the Houthis, was they got really good at hitting their oil facilities, and they don't want that to happen again. So it's just interesting to see the divide here. And, I mean, who knows? This just doesn't seem like it's going in a good direction. Things are going to escalate in some way. I wouldn't be surprised if tomorrow the U.S. bombed Yemen, or we wake up and that's the news. I feel like it might only be a matter of time before the U.S. does that, and then who knows what could happen. So they're doing all this to protect Israel. All right, so then actually I'm going to do the fundraiser now. So it's still our fundraiser at antiwar.com. So go to antiwar.com/donate, see the different ways you can support us. This is how antiwar.com operates. We are entirely reader funded. That's how this show is possible. Right now we have matching funds, which means every dollar you give will be doubled. And it's almost the end of the year. Whatever you give to us, we are a nonprofit. You could write off on your taxes, less money to the war machine. I think that's one of the best pitches that I can make for you, is by giving us money. That's money of yours that's not going to fund these horrific atrocities that are happening overseas. So you could support us through credit card donations, PayPal, crypto. You could set up a monthly recurring donation. Many different ways to help us out. antiwar.com/donate. Okay, so now the next one here. Israel kills 300 in the West Bank since the start of the Gaza war. So this article is from The Cradle. And it says Israeli forces shot dead 4 Palestinians on the 18th of December, which was Monday, bringing the number killed in the occupied West Bank to over 300 since the start of the Gaza war. Israeli troops invaded the Al-Farah refugee camp near Tubas on Monday and shot Mohammed Samir Milhelm, 17, and his brother Hikmat, 24, and Yazan Khatib, 20, in the head, and Rashid Habib al-Aidi, 17, in the chest. Though attention is largely focused on Gaza, where Israeli forces have killed some 18,000 Palestinians, health ministry officials say 301 Palestinians have now been killed by Israeli forces or settlers in the West Bank since October 7th. Earlier this month, Israeli forces shot dead 6 Palestinians, including a 14-year-old boy, in a raid on the refugee camp. The health ministry said the army confirmed at the time it had conducted a counterterrorism operation. An op-ed in the liberal Israeli daily Haaretz noted that recent attacks by the Israeli army and settlers in the West Bank have forced Palestinians to leave their villages and their land in the southern Hebron Hills and in the northern Jordan Valley. The op-ed said, quote, "They're an entirely defenseless population. Communities of shepherds with no means of protecting themselves have been victims of what is in effect a transfer that no one in Israel is talking about," end quote. And this, if this was happening and in this Gaza war wasn't happening, this would be have all of the attention. So they're doing this. They're taking advantage, basically, of the war, of what's happening in Gaza. To the settlers are taking advantage to kick more Palestinians out of their homes, and the IDF is conducting these raids. So I know before October 7th, over 200 Palestinians were killed, and I believe that was including in the West Bank and Gaza, because Israel did launch some airstrikes in Gaza over the summer, and that was a big deal, that over 200 were killed. So now it's been over 300 in just over 2 months. All right, so the next one here. The U.S. can only fund one more Ukraine arms package. So the White House said on Monday that a weapons package will be provided to Ukraine later this month, and after that, the U.S. will be out of funds to arm Ukraine until Congress authorizes more spending on the proxy war. So the Pentagon still has $4.4 billion in presidential drawdown authority, which allows the U.S. to send weapons to Ukraine straight from military stockpiles. So they have $4.4 billion left in that. But the issue is, according to the White House, that they're going to run out of funding needed to replenish the arms being sent. So they can't replace the stuff that they're sending over there, and they've sent so much to Ukraine that they can't spare much more. So Mike McCord, who's the Pentagon's comptroller, he made Congress aware of the situation in a letter that he sent on Sunday. So John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesman, said, quote, "We are still planning one more aid package to Ukraine later this month. However, when that one's done, as the comptroller, Mr. McCord, made clear in his note to Congress today, we will have no more replenishment authority available to us, and we're going to need Congress to act without a delay, as we have been saying," end quote. So the Biden administration wants over $60 billion for Ukraine and has been pleading with Congress to approve this big $111 billion military aid package that it's requested. The Republicans are still holding out for a border deal, but they just continue to make these pleas to Congress really sound like they're begging. So it's not clear when this Ukraine aid will be approved. I think, unfortunately, that it probably will be eventually, because the Republicans are not saying, I mean, some Republicans that are against funding the war in Ukraine, but Republican leadership, and it seems like for the most part, Republicans are saying, give us this border deal, then we'll give you whatever you want in Ukraine. So that seems to be the deal. And this next one here, Ukraine replanning military operations due to ammo shortage. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute, And it says a top Ukrainian commander warned that Kiev's ammunition depots are running low, causing military leaders to reassess operations. And this statement comes with the White House saying they're running out. They only got one more weapons package that they could send. So this Ukrainian brigadier general said that the military was replanning its efforts due to shell shortages seen across the entire front line. And he called the shortages a very big problem. He said, quote, "There's a problem with ammunition, especially post-Soviet shells that's 122 millimeter, 152 millimeter. And today these problems exist across the entire front line. The volumes that we have today are not sufficient for us today given our needs. So we're redistributing it. We're replanning tasks that we have set for ourselves and making them smaller because we need to provide for them," end quote. So just more examples of it's just not a good situation for the Ukrainians fighting on the front lines. That they don't even have enough ammo to do what they want to do. All right, so the next one here, a U.S. airstrike reported in Somalia for the first time in months. So the U.S. launched an airstrike in southern Somalia on Sunday as part of an operation in collaboration with the Mogadishu-based government. This was reported by Voice of America, which is a U.S. state-funded media. The U.S.-backed government claimed that the operation killed a senior al-Shabaab commander. U.S. Africa Command confirmed the accuracy of the government's report to Voice of America, although AFRICOM has not announced the strike in a press release. Usually they put out press releases announcing their airstrikes, although not all U.S. airstrikes are officially acknowledged in Somalia. The last declared U.S. airstrike in Somalia took place in August, so a few months back. The monitoring group Air Wars has reported several suspected U.S. airstrikes in Somalia in the month of September. But again, the last time AFRICOM claimed a strike was in August, so it's been a while. And I always check AFRICOM, usually every day to see if they have announced any airstrikes. And it's been one of the places where I'm like, all right, at least we're not bombing Somalia. But here we have another airstrike. And let's see, where was I in this article? So U.S. airstrikes in Somalia, they escalated in 2022 after President Biden ordered the deployment of up to 500 troops to the country, and the Mogadishu-based government launched an offensive against al-Shabaab. I always say Mogadishu-based because they don't control, when people think of the Somali government, they might imagine a government that controls, the borders of Somalia, but you have Somaliland in the north, that's kind of their own autonomous thing. Different tribal groups control other areas, and al-Shabaab controls a decent amount of territory. So anyway, Biden ordered up to 500 troops to go there in 2022. Earlier this year, the House debated a resolution to withdraw from Somalia that failed. But during that debate, that legislation was introduced by Matt Gaetz, and he and some other members of Congress said that there were 900 U.S. troops in Somalia. And U.S. operations in Somalia under President Biden have not gotten as intense as they were during the Trump administration. Under Trump, the U.S. actually bombed Somalia at a record pace, more than any other years. It was, I believe 2020, it was about something like 50 to 60 airstrikes, U.S. airstrikes in Somalia. So it was real heavy bombing. He pulled out some troops from Somalia, and then Biden came in and put him back in. And that's when things started to escalate again. So the just a little background on al-Shabaab. I always include this because it's just important context. And I linked to an article from Scott Horton. It's actually adapted from, it's basically a chapter from his book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, about Somalia. And it has really good background. And basically, al-Shabaab, they're painted as this big global threat because they're affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and they are a pretty, relatively large group. But it is widely believed, and, you don't have to look outside of mainstream sources to see this, that al-Shabaab does not have ambitions outside of Somalia. And they were born out of a U.S.-backed Ethiopian invasion in 2006. The U.S. backed that to oust the Islamic Courts Union, which just took over Mogadishu from CIA-backed warlords. And the Islamic Courts Union was kind of a coalition of different Muslim groups. And after they were ousted, they were kicked out of power by Ethiopia. The Al-Shabaab was the radical offshoot of the Islamic Courts Union, and their first recorded attack was in 2007 against Ethiopian troops occupying Mogadishu. And it wasn't until 2012, 5 years after that, that they declared loyalty to Al-Qaeda. All right, so the next one here, U.S. granted access to 15 military bases in Finland. The U.S. and Finland signed a defense cooperation agreement on Monday that gives the U.S. access to 15 bases in the Nordic nation. And Finland shares an over 800-mile border with Russia. And one of these sites, according to the Barents Observer, is in the northernmost site is at a border guard base in Ivalo that is on the Russian border. It says that the town is located only about 30 miles from the Russian border, but this one facility is called a border guard base that the U.S. is getting access to. Moscow has warned that it will respond to the expansion of NATO infrastructure in Finland by basically building up its military assets in Western Russia. The Kremlin said on Friday, a few days before this deal was signed, that it will increase tensions in the region. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, quote, "This will certainly lead to tension. We can only regret this. We had excellent relations with Finland. No one threatened anyone. There were no problems or complaints against each other. No one infringed on anyone's interests. There was mutual respect. But now, when Finland is a NATO member and NATO's military infrastructure will already enter Finnish territory, this will pose an obvious threat to us," end quote. And I really just do not understand why Finland is doing this. I mean, I guess it's their political elite that want to, get in with the crowd in Brussels and be part of all this. But you see, the militarization now of the Finnish-Russian border. I believe Finland's closed its border with Russia now. And it's just, I just don't understand it. So the defense cooperation agreement needs to be approved by the Finnish parliament. And once that happens, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that once this agreement goes into effect, quote, "Our militaries will be able to collaborate more efficiently and more effectively. Our troops will have more opportunities to train together, and we will bolster NATO's interoperability," end quote. So the U.S. signed a similar deal with Sweden that I covered, and that gives the U.S. access to 17 military bases in Sweden. Sweden is still not in NATO. They're still waiting for Turkey and Hungary to ratify their membership. All right, so the next one. We're going all over the world here. The U.S. is increasing military exercises with allies near China. So the U.S. is increasing military exercises with its allies in the Asia-Pacific that are meant as a message to China. And the commander of the U.S. Navy's Japan-based 7th Fleet said this in comments to the Washington Times. So this is Vice Admiral Carl O. Thomas. He said that the stepped-up exercises were meant to deter China, but tensions have only increased in the region, especially in the South China Sea, making conflict more likely. Thomas said that he believes, quote, "Being forward and having many nations working together is a grand deterrent effect that we really try to amplify. Everything we do, whether it's being present and forward or whether it's doing exercises with our like-minded allies and partners, it's all about deterring aggression," end quote. So you just have to look at the South China Sea to see how what the U.S. is doing is really just increasing tensions. Over the past year, the U.S. has bolstered its alliance with the Philippines and increased joint military activity in the South China Sea, where China, the Philippines, and several other Southeast Asian nations have overlapping claims. The U.S. has committed to going to war over the dispute by affirming that the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty applies to attacks on Philippine vessels in the South China Sea. The increased military ties between Washington and Manila coincided with significant uptick in dangerous encounters between Chinese and Philippine vessels near disputed reefs, which I cover a lot. And the reason why I cover those encounters is because the U.S. is committed to going to war if those Philippine vessels start getting fired at, and not just with water cannons, which China has done, but if this thing really turns hot, the U.S. is saying it will intervene. So, there's different factors for the reason why these encounters have increased. One is the new Philippine president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who came into power in 2022. He is taking a more aggressive approach to push back on China's claims. And China is basically showing that, you know, they're not going to back down in the face of this growing U.S. military presence. It's just not going to happen. And it's not going to deter them. I mean, it's just so obvious. And the U.S. has also been encouraging other allies in the region to increase military ties with the Philippines, including Japan and Australia. They're working on deals. France, Canada, and other Western nations are also increasing their presence in the contentious South China Sea. And despite the focus on supporting wars in Ukraine and Gaza, the U.S. military buildup aimed at China is still in full swing, which also includes establishing more bases in the region, plans to deploy new missile systems, and unprecedented support for Taiwan. And U.S. military officials have openly stated that they're preparing for a war with China. They say, our mission is to deter war, and if that fails, be ready to win a war. So this is an area I really wanted to focus more on, but everything with Gaza and Ukraine, it's been hard to. But, you know, it's still moving along. You know, the tensions there continue to rise. That is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Ted Snyder. Is Venezuela going to war to steal territory from Guyana? One from Ron Paul. The NDAA, Congress's gift to America this Christmas. One from Gideon Levy. In Israel, Gazans are responsible for their own deaths. I've never been so ashamed. And he's an Israeli journalist. One from Doug Bandow, America's Ukraine problem. And one from Daniel Larison, Israel is killing Gazans with hunger. So that is everything for me for today. That was quite a lot of stuff that I went over. Please, again, help us with our fundraiser, antiwar.com/donate. You could also share this show. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.